The Soviet Union, the most feared nation on Earth, built a nuclear bomber that was radioactively microwaving its own pilots, crashed it, and their official conclusion was the landing gear was the problem. Not the nuclear reactor. Cooking people, alive. These are the same geniuses who blew up an entire launch pad and told NASA nothing happened. Everything is fine, relax. We have 111 moments exactly like this, all real, all documented, and all more embarrassing than every dumb decision you have ever made combined. Like, subscribe and comment your dumbest life decision. Because trust me, these guys did worse. 1. The Soviet Union once built a bomber powered by a nuclear reactor, which sounds cool until you realize every crew member sitting inside would be slowly cooked alive by radiation before the enemy even spotted them. Test pilots near the prototype during ground tests walked away with radiation doses that would make any doctor faint. The Soviets essentially invented a flying death sentence for their own people and somehow thought this was a reasonable Tuesday afternoon project. 2. Imagine watching your moon rocket explode 4 separate times, with the third blast creating one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history, leveling the entire launch pad, and then just deciding none of it ever happened. The Soviet Union did exactly that with the N-1 rocket. They buried every photo, every report, and silenced every witness for 20 straight years while pretending their moon program was perfectly fine. NASA was genuinely clueless the whole time. 3. Funding your own enemies is a bold strategy, and the KGB pulled it off perfectly. They secretly poured money into Western anti-war protests during the Cold War, using shell organizations to hide the trail. Protests grew, Americans marched, and Moscow celebrated. Then an accountant somewhere noticed that some of that KGB money had accidentally funded groups protesting the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The KGB had bankrolled demonstrations against themselves. They quietly closed the ledger and never spoke of it again. 4. Genetics was going perfectly fine as a science until the Soviet government decided it was fascist and banned it. For 20 years, real biologists were fired or arrested for believing in DNA. A fraud named Lysenko convinced Stalin that crops could be emotionally encouraged to grow anywhere. Stalin loved this idea. Farmers planted using Lysenko's methods across the USSR. Every harvest failed exactly as actual scientists had predicted in writing. Millions starved while Lysenko collected government awards, and the scientists who were right collected gulag sentences. 5. Waiting a decade for a refrigerator sounds miserable enough on its own. Soviet citizens registered, waited 10 full years, and finally received their appliance with genuine excitement. Then they plugged it in. The machine was so aggressively loud that neighbors in adjoining apartments could hear it running through solid concrete walls every single night. 10 years of waiting delivered a refrigerator that performed like a cement mixer in a kitchen. Soviet quality control reviewed the complaints, filed them appropriately, and continued manufacturing the exact same model. 6. Fooling American spy satellites was a genuine Soviet priority, and they committed to it completely. Entire fake cities were constructed with functioning smokestacks, paved roads, and industrial buildings that looked completely operational from orbit. Inside every building was absolutely nothing. No workers, no equipment, no production of any kind. American analysts studied these facilities seriously for years. Meanwhile, Soviet officials sat underneath those empty buildings, deeply satisfied that they had convinced the most powerful intelligence apparatus on Earth that they were doing things they were entirely not doing. 7. Permafrost is frozen ground that does not grow wheat under any political system. Stalin did not accept this. A scientist named Lysenko told him crops could be ideologically motivated, and Stalin ordered wheat planted across Siberian permafrost immediately. Actual agricultural scientists submitted formal written warnings explaining exactly why this would fail. Those scientists were ignored. The permafrost ignored the ideology. Every single crop died on schedule. Millions of Soviet citizens starved from the resulting shortage, while Lysenko received another state award and the warning scientists disappeared into the gulag system. 8. Surprise attacks require the enemy not to hear you coming. which is why the Soviet hovercraft military fleet was such a creative disaster. These machines were so extraordinarily loud during operation that opposing forces could detect them from 20 miles away. 20 miles of advance warning, completely free, delivered personally by the Soviet Navy. Military planners wrote actual tactical manuals attempting to explain how to use vessels that announced themselves across an entire coastline. The fleet was real, the guns were loaded, and every enemy in the region always knew exactly where they were. 9. Declaring your currency valuable by government announcement is not how economics works, but the Soviet Union tried it anyway. Officials decreed the ruble worth more than the American dollar and published this as established fact. Western tourists who exchanged money through legitimate legal channels immediately discovered that 90% of their real purchasing power had evaporated in the transaction. The ruble was worth more than the dollar, in the same sense that a theater ticket is worth more than the building. Soviet economists submitted quarterly reports confirming the exchange rate remained ideologically sound. 10. Somewhere beneath Russia during the Cold War, a machine called Dead Hand sat quietly waiting for the worst day in human history. It was designed to automatically launch every Soviet nuclear missile the moment sensors detected an incoming strike, requiring zero human authorization whatsoever. Terrifying enough as a concept. The genuinely remarkable part is that the Soviets forgot to mention it existed to anyone outside their own government. Western diplomats negotiated arms treaties completely unaware an automated apocalypse system was already running. The world learned about Dead Hand in 1993, 2 years after the USSR dissolved. 11. Nobody asked what happened to the Soviet space shuttle after its one and only flight, but the answer deserves to be heard. The Buran launched unmanned in 1988, completed 2 orbits, landed automatically, and was immediately celebrated as a triumph of Soviet engineering. Then, it was parked in a hangar and never flown again. In 2002, the hangar roof collapsed directly onto it, destroying the most expensive vehicle the Soviet space program ever built. The Buran survived space and was killed by a ceiling. 12. Soviet televisions came with a fire extinguisher included in the box, and that detail requires a moment of appreciation. This was not a precaution or a legal formality. Soviet TVs spontaneously caught fire at a documented rate high enough that the government decided extinguishers were standard equipment rather than fixing the televisions. Citizens would sit down for an evening of state programming, fire extinguisher nearby, prepared for the possibility that their entertainment might attempt to burn their apartment down. The sets continued shipping with extinguishers for years. 13. The CIA spotted something enormous moving across the Caspian Sea in the 1960s and spent an entire decade trying to figure out what it was. Soviets called it the Ekranoplan, a 550-ton ground effect vehicle that flew just above the water surface at high speed. The CIA nicknamed it the Caspian Sea Monster and genuinely feared it. Then it was deployed in combat conditions and promptly crashed because it was nearly impossible to steer. The most feared mystery vehicle of the Cold War was destroyed by a coastline. 14. Soviet military doctors had access to frequency machines that could allegedly cure cancer, alcoholism, and various other serious conditions using targeted sound waves. These devices had no measurable output of any kind. Scientists who tested them found nothing happening at any frequency. The machines were producing effects that did not exist in physical reality. The Soviet military purchased them in significant quantities anyway, deployed them to medical facilities across the USSR, and filed procurement reports describing successful treatment outcomes from equipment that was technically just a box with dials on it. 15. Somewhere in Siberia, the KGB built a replica American town and staffed it entirely with English-speaking Soviet agents who lived as Americans around the clock. They shopped at fake American stores, argued about fake American politics, and practiced being convincingly ordinary. The program ran for years, training spies to blend into the United States. When Moscow finally shut it down and told everyone to go home, several agents refused to leave. They had been American so long and so completely that returning to being Soviet apparently felt like the less appealing option. 16. Soviet factory workers operated under production quotas measured purely by weight, which created an incentive system that rewarded the wrong behavior completely. Nail factories discovered that producing fewer, enormously heavy nails hit their weight quota faster than producing thousands of useful ones. So they made nails the size of railroad spikes that no construction project could practically use. The quota was met. The report went to Moscow showing full production. Somewhere across the USSR, builders waited for nails that technically existed but were functionally useless, and everyone involved considered this a success. 17. An abandoned Soviet nuclear lighthouse in the Arctic sat quietly until local fishermen spotted it and decided the metal looked valuable. They broke it open for scrap without reading any warning labels, possibly because there were none, and spread radioactive material across the surrounding beach in the process. The lighthouse had been nuclear-powered, unmanned, and left running in the middle of nowhere because the Soviets trusted that nobody would find it and start disassembling it for parts. The fishermen found it immediately and disassembled it for parts. 18. The Tsar Bomba was the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated, and the Soviets set it off just to see what would happen. The explosion shattered windows in Finland. The shockwave circled the entire Earth 3 times. The plane that dropped it barely escaped and still sustained damage from its own payload. After the test, Soviet engineers sat down to discuss practical military applications for a bomb this size and came up with absolutely nothing useful. They never built another one because nobody could answer the basic question of what you actually do with it. 19. Soviet cosmonauts carried suicide pills on every mission, which sounds extreme until you understand the alternative. Soviet re-entry trajectory calculations were unreliable enough that mission planners genuinely could not guarantee where the capsule would land. If a cosmonaut drifted into enemy territory, capture was considered a serious possibility. The pills were the official solution to that problem. Rather than improving the navigation systems, the Soviet space program issued chemical insurance policies to their astronauts and filed it under standard equipment. American astronauts received Tang. Soviet cosmonauts received the option to not be captured. 20. The Zaporozhets was the Soviet answer to the automobile, and it had one defining characteristic that its manufacturers described as fuel efficiency. The car was so dramatically underpowered that owners routinely got out and pushed it uphill, rather than attempt the incline under engine power. This was not considered a design failure. Soviet automotive engineers officially categorized the pushing requirement as evidence of excellent fuel economy, since the engine was not being used. Advertisements described it as practical and efficient. Drivers described it as a very heavy object they occasionally sat inside between pushing sessions. 21. Private garden plots in the Soviet Union were tiny, restricted, and barely tolerated by the government. They represented just 3% of all agricultural land in the entire USSR. Those neglected little patches of dirt that Soviet citizens tended in their spare time produced over 25% of the country's total food supply. The vast collective farms with their enormous resources, centralized planning, and government oversight produced the remaining 75% across 97% of the land. Soviet citizens essentially fed themselves through gardening as a hobby, while the official food system struggled to justify its own existence. 22. Telepathy is not real, which the Soviet military chose to treat as an unconfirmed hypothesis rather than settled science. For over 30 years, they funded research into telepathy and remote viewing for military applications, spending the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars searching for psychic soldiers. Every experiment produced nothing replicable. Every result evaporated under scrutiny. Scientists submitted findings showing the phenomenon did not exist and received funding for another study to check again. The program ran for 3 decades because admitting it was nonsense required someone senior enough to say so out loud. 23. Soviet intelligence ran a global operation planting fake stories inside Western newspapers to manipulate public opinion, and it worked beautifully until it worked too well. One fabricated story spread so thoroughly through Western media that it became widely accepted as established fact. Then Soviet officials, reading Western sources as research material, encountered their own invented story and began citing it as evidence in internal government reports. The KGB had successfully fooled its own analysts with its own propaganda. The fake story was now informing real Soviet policy decisions. 24. Nuclear artillery shells fired from a cannon is already a concept that requires a moment of quiet reflection. The Soviet military developed exactly this weapon and deployed it in the field. The cannon was inaccurate at the distances required for a nuclear detonation to be safely away from the crew firing it. Military analysts calculated that the crew operating the weapon had roughly equal odds of being vaporized by their own shell as eliminating the target. Soviet military doctrine classified this as an acceptable operational parameter and issued the cannons to actual soldiers. 25. Project Pluto was a Soviet nuclear ramjet cruise missile that actually worked, which made it one of the more terrifying achievements of the Cold War. The missile flew by, sucking in air, passing it through an unshielded nuclear reactor, and expelling it as superheated exhaust. Everything the missile flew over received a dose of radiation from the engine. The problem Soviet engineers eventually acknowledged was that any return flight path over Soviet territory would irradiate Soviet citizens on the ground below. The missile worked perfectly and was quietly shelved because it was too effective in the wrong direction. 26. Getting a telephone installed in a Soviet apartment required submitting an application and then waiting. The average wait was 8 years. Citizens would apply for a phone line, move on with their lives, have children, watch those children grow significantly, and eventually receive a rotary telephone mechanically identical to models from the 1940s. The technology had not advanced because there was no incentive to advance it. The phone arrived, was plugged into the wall, and worked exactly as a 1940s telephone worked, which was considered a satisfactory outcome by everyone involved in the installation process. 27. Someone in Soviet agricultural planning authorized shipping an entire trainload of tomatoes from Ukraine to Moscow during summer without refrigeration. The tomatoes began their journey as food. By the time the train arrived in Moscow, 80% of the cargo had liquefied completely from the heat. The remaining 20% were generously described as soft. The shipment was logged in official records as delivered, the quota was marked complete, and Moscow received documentation confirming the successful transfer of tomatoes from Ukraine. What Moscow actually received was a train car full of warm tomato liquid and paperwork describing it as produce. 28. The Baikonur Cosmodrome was the Soviet Union's primary launch facility and the place where humanity first reached space. It was built by Gulag prisoners in the middle of a desert under brutal conditions. After construction, the facility's precise location was classified so completely that it was assigned a fake city name for mailing purposes. Scientists working at the most important rocket facility on Earth sent letters home addressed to a place that officially did not exist. Rocket engineers who helped launch humans into orbit could not tell their families where they actually worked. 29. The KGB decided that communism needed better marketing and commissioned an entire genre of fake American folk songs performed by Soviet artists. The songs were designed to make socialist ideology sound culturally appealing to Western audiences. They were distributed with genuine strategic intent. None of them charted anywhere in the Western world. This part was expected. The part that required additional explanation was that none of them charted inside the Soviet Union either. Soviet citizens, given the choice between real music and KGB folk songs about collectivization, chose real music with enough consistency to make the entire program statistically invisible. 30. Soviet engineers built a massive antenna array designed to jam Western radio signals and prevent Soviet citizens from hearing capitalist programming. It worked extremely well. It worked so well that the jamming field disrupted Soviet military radio frequencies operating in the same spectrum. Army commanders discovered during field exercises that their own communications were being blocked by their own jamming system. The antenna had to be switched off during military maneuvers so Soviet forces could communicate with each other. The system built to silence the West was periodically silenced itself so the Soviet military could function. 31. Sinking on your very first field test is a bold way for a tank to make its opinion known. The object. 279 was so extraordinarily heavy that it pushed straight through the soil during its debut outing and had to be abandoned where it sat. Recovery crews eventually dragged it out, but the message was clear. It never entered production and today sits permanently in a Russian tank museum, as a monument to building something so dense that the Earth itself rejected it. 32. Nobody built Laika a way home, and the Soviet government knew this before the rocket ever left the ground. She was the first living creature sent to orbit Earth, celebrated globally as a triumph of Soviet science. What the USSR quietly omitted for 45 years was that her death was planned from the beginning. The rocket had no return mechanism because nobody designed one. The world cheered for a dog in space, while every Soviet official smiling for cameras already knew exactly how her story was always going to end. 33. Standing next to your washing machine for the entire cycle manually flipping switches sounds like a punishment, but Soviet engineers called it a home appliance. The machine could not operate independently. It required continuous human supervision, precise manual interventions at timed intervals, and a 14-page instruction manual to explain the process. Soviet designers created a device that demanded more active effort from the user than simply washing clothes by hand, then packaged it as modern domestic technology. The manual was considered comprehensive, and the appliance was considered an advancement. 34. Crossing cattle with yaks to survive Siberian winters seemed logical until the actual animal arrived on Soviet farms. The hybrid survived the cold adequately, but produced 1/3 of normal milk output and was violently hostile toward the humans attempting to dairy farm it. Farmers promised a hardier and more productive animal, received something that kicked harder, produced less, and approached human beings with a level of personal resentment that standard cows rarely demonstrate. Soviet agricultural reports classified the results as encouraging and recommended continued breeding. 35. Reusing syringes between patients was standard Soviet hospital practice for decades because disposable equipment did not fit neatly into quota systems. In 1988, an HIV outbreak was traced directly to a children's ward where needles had been routinely shared among young patients. The government learned about the outbreak and spent more than a year controlling the information before it became impossible to suppress. Children had contracted HIV from routine medical care inside a government facility, and the official priority was managing public knowledge of the situation rather than stopping the practice that caused it. 36. Producing a magazine so boring it became a CIA training tool was not the intended outcome of Soviet literature, but it is the legacy it earned. Published in English specifically for Western audiences, every issue arrived with the warmth and readability of a municipal zoning document. Agency analysts reportedly assigned it to new recruits as an attention endurance test. Finishing a complete issue without losing focus was considered adequate preparation for the concentration demands of intelligence work. Soviet cultural diplomacy had accidentally created the world's most effective cure for insomnia. 37. Shoe production in the Soviet Union was technically meeting every quota while simultaneously making shoes that most citizens could not wear. Factories manufacturing women's footwear produced exclusively in one size. Men's shoes came in one size. Every other size appeared in official production documents as being manufactured and was not. Soviet citizens whose feet fell outside the two approved sizes searched store shelves that official records confirmed were fully stocked. Moscow received quarterly reports showing complete success across the entire Soviet footwear industry, while millions of people walked around in shoes that did not fit. 38. Ham radio operators across the United States, Europe, and Australia started hearing a strange repetitive signal blasting through their frequencies in the 1970s. It was powerful enough to disrupt shortwave communications globally, and the complaints reached international organizations quickly. When those organizations formally approached the Soviet Union for an explanation, officials responded that no such signal existed. The Soviets delivered this statement continuously for an entire decade, while the signal broadcast without a single interruption from transmitters the USSR officially maintained were not operating. 39. Astronaut combat was apparently a serious enough military scenario that the Soviet Union developed a dedicated weapon for it. Engineers produced a shoulder-fired laser rifle in 1984, specifically designed to blind enemy astronauts during space engagements. The finished weapon weighed 12 pounds and had an effective range shorter than a standard pistol. Soviet military procurement accepted delivery of a heavy, close-range laser gun intended for zero-gravity orbital combat against enemies who had never appeared in orbit, to solve a problem that had genuinely never occurred anywhere in the history of space exploration. 40. 19. Soviet attempts to reach Mars produced a record of failures so consistent it became almost impressive. The greatest victory in that entire program was a probe that successfully transmitted data from the Martian surface for 20 seconds before going permanently silent. Moscow announced this outcome as a partial success and released a statement describing it as scientifically meaningful. Engineers who dedicated years of their careers to building that probe watched it die faster than a commercial break and were immediately assigned to begin development on the next attempt. 41. Record players shipping pre-scratched from the factory is the kind of quality control decision that takes genuine commitment to get wrong. Soviet record players left the assembly line with a damaged stylus mold that scratched every record during playback. Engineers identified the problem, documented it, and nobody corrected the mold. Millions of units shipped that way across 15 years of uninterrupted production. Soviet citizens bought brand new record players, put on their favorite albums, and listened to music that sounded like it was being played through a gravel driveway. The factory kept the quota. 42. Khrushchev decided corn should grow everywhere across the Soviet Union and issued the order with the confidence of a man who had never personally grown anything. Corn requires specific climate conditions that large portions of the USSR simply do not have. Agricultural scientists explained this clearly. Planting happened anyway across regions where corn biologically cannot survive. Every crop failed. The catastrophe was so complete and so widespread that Russians developed a specific phrase for it that translates roughly as corn madness, and it entered the language permanently as a description of enthusiastic ignorance producing inevitable disaster. 43. Cancer was a disease of capitalism according to official Soviet medical ideology, which created an immediate practical problem for Soviet doctors diagnosing it. Officially acknowledging cancer in a Soviet patient implied that capitalism had somehow reached inside a communist body and caused illness there. The solution was to stop diagnosing it. Patients who had cancer received documentation listing unnamed blood disorders, vague cellular conditions, and unspecified internal complications. They died of these unnamed things while their official cause of death confirmed that Soviet citizens did not get diseases that only existed under capitalism. 44. Soviet propaganda posters depicting American poverty were detailed, dramatic, and deeply committed to their message. They showed breadlines, despair, and urban misery rendered in vivid illustration. When actual Americans visited the USSR during cultural exchange programs and saw these posters, they laughed, not politely, genuinely and loudly. Soviet officials observed this reaction, consulted among themselves, and reached the conclusion that Americans laughing at depictions of their own suffering was a psychological defense mechanism rooted in capitalist denial. The Soviets documented American laughter as evidence that the posters were accurate and the Americans were uncomfortable. 45. Moving into a new Soviet apartment and discovering it had no interior walls is the kind of surprise that redefines the concept of a fresh start. Construction quotas measured completion by the number of units finished, rather than whether those units contained basic structural features. Builders met their numbers by delivering apartment shells that technically existed as completed units on paper. Residents arrived with furniture, boxes, and families and discovered open floor plans that nobody had designed intentionally. The quota was marked complete. The family stood in their new home holding a hammer and wondering where the walls went. 46. Line X was the KGB division responsible for stealing Western technology, and it operated with remarkable efficiency for decades. They acquired so much Western industrial equipment and software that Soviet factories eventually ran pirated copies of IBM computer systems throughout their operations. Then the documentation problem emerged. Because everything was stolen rather than purchased, the Soviets had no access to official technical support, update pathways, or original manuals. The systems ran until something went wrong, and then nobody knew how to fix them because the paperwork explaining how they worked had never been part of the theft. 47. Novichok was among the most dangerous nerve agents ever synthesized, and the Soviet scientists building it were so committed to secrecy that they used fake names for the compounds in every internal document. Different departments working on the same project used different fake names for identical substances. Years of research produced a situation where Soviet scientists arguing about their own nerve agents were sometimes arguing about the same chemical under different names without realizing it. The program designed to confuse Western intelligence had successfully confused the Soviet scientists running it. 48. Catching a returning space capsule with an airplane mid-flight was the Soviet solution to spacecraft recovery, and it was tested exactly once. The plan required a specially equipped plane to intercept the descending capsule at a precise altitude and grab it before it hit the ground. During the test, the plane missed. The capsule did not get caught. Engineers reviewed the attempt, assessed the variables, determined that the fundamental concept of intercepting a falling spacecraft with an airplane presented challenges that further testing was unlikely to resolve, and quietly canceled the program without further public discussion. 49. American blue jeans became one of the most powerful currencies in the Soviet black market because Soviet-manufactured denim was so visibly inferior that citizens refused to accept the substitution. The state produced jeans. Nobody wanted them. Authentic Levi's, smuggled through various channels, sold for an entire month of average Soviet salary. A pair of pants became a meaningful financial asset. Soviet citizens were willing to spend 30 days of wages on denim because the alternative was wearing the state-approved version, which apparently represented a worse outcome than spending a month's income on clothing. 50. Soviet planners diverted 2 entire rivers feeding Central Asia to irrigate cotton fields, which damaged the regional ecosystem permanently. The cotton grew. Then it grew too much. Overproduction became so severe that the government began paying workers to harvest cotton and then burn it because storing the surplus was logistically impossible. Workers were employed full-time picking cotton that was immediately destroyed after harvest. The rivers that no longer flowed left dried riverbeds that became salt deserts. The Aral Sea, which those rivers had fed for centuries, shrank to a fraction of its original size and has never recovered. 51. Sluggish schizophrenia was a mental illness invented by Soviet psychiatry with one very specific defining symptom. The symptom was disagreeing with the Soviet government. Citizens who expressed political dissent, filed complaints about living conditions, or simply asked uncomfortable questions in public could be diagnosed by a state psychiatrist and committed to a psychiatric facility. No other evidence of mental illness was required. The diagnosis existed exclusively in Soviet medical literature and was applied exclusively to people who had demonstrated the clinical warning sign of finding fault with how the USSR was being run. 52. Liquid metal coolant in a submarine reactor sounds innovative until you consider what happens when anything goes wrong. Soviet engineers built submarines using this system, and it functioned adequately under perfect conditions. When something malfunctioned, the liquid metal coolant solidified instantly, freezing the reactor into a permanent, immovable mass inside the vessel. The submarine became an enormous radioactive object with no operational future and no straightforward disposal solution. 3 of these submarines experienced exactly this outcome. Each one transformed from a military asset into a floating hazardous waste problem that the Soviet Navy had not budgeted for. 53. Radio Moscow broadcast internationally in 80 languages as a Soviet soft power project designed to reach every corner of the globe with communist messaging. Among those 80 languages was Welsh. The Welsh language service broadcast continuously for 40 consecutive years. Researchers tracking audience metrics for the program recorded 0 measurable listeners across all 4 decades of transmission. Not a small audience. Not a disappointing audience. 0. The Soviet Union spent 40 years broadcasting propaganda in Welsh to an audience that rounded to nothing, and continued funding the service because nobody wanted to be the person who canceled it. 54. Leon Theremin built a listening device for the KGB that had no battery, no power source, and no active components of any kind. It was a completely passive object that only activated when hit with the right radio frequency from outside. This device was hidden inside a wooden carving of the American seal and presented as a gift to the U.S. ambassador, who hung it proudly on his office wall. It sat there transmitting conversations for 7 years. Western counterintelligence eventually found it and spent considerable time refusing to believe it was real because the technology seemed physically impossible. 55. Sverdlovsk, in 1979, experienced an anthrax outbreak that killed dozens of people in the surrounding city. The source was a Soviet bioweapons facility that had accidentally released a cloud of engineered anthrax into the air. The Soviet government's immediate response was to blame contaminated black market meat. This explanation was maintained officially, consistently, and with complete commitment for 13 years. Soviet officials attributed deaths from an airborne military bioweapons accident to bad sausage purchases until 1992, when the actual cause was finally acknowledged after the USSR had already ceased to exist. 56. Alexei Leonov became the first human to walk in space and nearly became the first human to die there because his spacesuit inflated in the vacuum to a point where he could no longer bend his limbs or fit back through the airlock hatch. He was floating in open space attached to a tether, unable to get back inside the spacecraft. His solution was to open a valve on his suit and slowly bleed air out while still in vacuum, reducing the inflation enough to squeeze through the hatch. He made it back inside, and Soviet press releases described the spacewalk as proceeding nominally. 57. Soviet light bulb factories discovered early that producing bulbs with shorter lifespans was actually better for their production quotas. A bulb that lasted longer meant fewer replacement bulbs needed, which meant lower future demand, which meant a reduced quota next year. Engineers therefore produced bulbs that burned out in roughly 200 hours on purpose. Workers called this arrangement planned darkness, as an internal joke that was also an accurate description of official policy. Soviet citizens replaced light bulbs constantly, while factories reported excellent production numbers, and the relationship between those two facts was never formally acknowledged in any government document. 58. Running two completely separate rocket design bureaus simultaneously with identical missions and identical budgets was the Soviet approach to space program management. Chelomey and Yangel were given the same objectives, the same resources, and told to compete. Both teams built hardware. Neither team's work was ever combined with the other. Years of parallel development produced duplicate rockets, duplicate systems, and duplicate costs, while NASA operated as a single unified agency pointing everything in one direction. The Soviets spent the space race occasionally racing against themselves and wondering why the Americans kept arriving at destinations first. 59. Soviet cosmetic product lines launched nationwide with genuine fanfare and produced a measurable medical outcome nobody had planned for. Dermatologists across the USSR recorded a documented spike in facial rashes, chemical burns, and allergic reactions every single time a new state cosmetics range became available in stores. The formulations were chemically unstable in ways that became apparent primarily after prolonged contact with human skin. Soviet women received lipstick and foundation that worked adequately as makeup and simultaneously as a mild skin irritant. Quality control reviewed the dermatology reports and continued approving the same formulations for continued production. 60. Soviet fishing fleets operated at a financial loss so profound that the government was effectively subsidizing free fish for the ocean. Every voyage cost more than the catch was worth. The math was consistent and well documented. None of this stopped the fleets from sailing because quotas required them to sail regardless of economic outcome. The truly remarkable part was that despite operating the largest subsidized fishing operation in the world at a continuous loss, Soviet cities still experienced chronic fish shortages. The USSR was hemorrhaging money fishing and still could not reliably stock its own grocery shelves with fish. 61. Cryonics research at a Soviet state institute continued receiving full government funding for 14 years after its own lead scientist stood up in a meeting and told everyone the technique did not work. The scientist was not fired. The funding was not canceled. The institute continued operating, submitting reports, and consuming budget allocations while producing zero replicable results across the entire program. Soviet bureaucracy had created a system where admitting failure required more courage than any scientist was willing to display. So the institute kept running on momentum, and nobody wanted to sign the cancellation paperwork. 62. The Iron Curtain border fortifications used so much barbed wire across their entire length that after the Soviet collapse in 1991, someone calculated the scrap metal value of all that wire. The number was estimated to exceed the entire gross domestic product of several newly independent former Soviet republics. The USSR had spent so extravagantly on keeping people inside its borders that the fence itself was worth more than the economies of the countries it had been containing. Former Soviet citizens were now living in nations worth less than the wire that had been used to trap them there. 63. Pravda means truth, and Izvestia means news. And Soviet citizens were so thoroughly aware that neither publication contained either thing that a joke about it spread across the entire country. The joke said that in truth there is no news, and in news there is no truth. This joke was told openly, repeated constantly, and understood universally by everyone living under the Soviet system, including the people working at both newspapers. The two most important publications in the USSR had earned a national punchline that perfectly summarized their editorial philosophy, and everyone involved knew it. 64. Khrushchevka. Apartment blocks were designed and built with an engineered structural lifespan of 25 years. Engineers calculated the materials, assessed the construction methods, and determined these buildings would remain functional for a quarter century before requiring replacement. That deadline passed decades ago. Today, more than 65 years after construction, tens of thousands of Khrushchevkas remain occupied across Russia, and former Soviet states with their original plumbing still installed and still operating. Millions of people are currently living inside buildings that Soviet engineers themselves certified should have been demolished 40 years ago. 65. Soviet intelligence ran a disinformation campaign in the 1980s, claiming the CIA had deliberately invented and released the AIDS virus. The operation was called Infection, and it worked with a thoroughness that surprised even the people running it. By 1992, surveys found that 15% of Americans believed the CIA had created AIDS. That number has never returned to zero in any subsequent survey taken since. A story the KGB manufactured and planted in foreign newspapers permanently lodged itself into a measurable portion of American public belief and has remained there for over 30 years. 66. Somewhere on the shortwave spectrum, a Soviet radio station called the Buzzer has been broadcasting a repeating foghorn tone continuously since 1976. It has never stopped. It broadcast through the Soviet collapse, through the transition to Russia, through every geopolitical shift of the past 5 decades, and it is still broadcasting right now. Nobody outside Russian military intelligence has ever publicly decoded what it transmits or confirmed its purpose. It kept broadcasting without explanation through the death of the country that built it, which raises the specific question of whether anyone currently in charge actually knows how to turn it off. 67. Lunokhod. 2 drove 39 kilometers across the lunar surface in 1973, making it one of the most successful Soviet space missions ever conducted. Then it drove into a freshly formed crater. The rover coated its thermal radiator completely in lunar dust during the crater incident, which prevented the radiator from releasing heat, which caused the internal temperature to rise uncontrollably, which destroyed the electronics permanently. The most successful Soviet lunar rover in history ended its mission by accidentally driving into a hole and overheating itself to death in a location it did not need to visit. 68. Soviet government revenue depended heavily on vodka sales to a degree that made Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign in 1985 an economic catastrophe dressed as a public health initiative. Production was slashed, sales dropped dramatically, and the budget shortfall that followed was immediate and severe. Economists studying the Soviet collapse have identified the vodka revenue collapse as a meaningful financial accelerant of the entire dissolution process. The Soviet Union built a state budget substantially dependent on its citizens drinking heavily, and when a leader tried to make them drink less, the resulting budget crisis helped bring down the government. 69. Soviet medical textbooks published in the 1980s still listed bloodletting as a recommended clinical treatment for certain fever conditions. Not as a historical footnote, not as an example of discredited past practice, as a current option available to practicing physicians treating patients in Soviet hospitals. Bloodletting had been understood as medically useless in Western medicine for over a century by the time these textbooks were printed and distributed to Soviet medical schools. Soviet doctors trained on these materials graduated with treatment options that included deliberately removing blood from sick people as a therapeutic intervention. 70. Nuclear icebreakers were one area where Soviet engineers genuinely, unambiguously built something better than anyone else on Earth. These vessels were engineered so far beyond what was technically necessary that they remain the most powerful icebreakers in the world today, decades after the Soviet Union stopped existing. Every other Cold War Soviet technology comes with asterisks, caveats, and collapse stories. The nuclear icebreaker fleet just works, keeps working, and outperforms everything built since. It stands as the single clearest example that Soviet engineers were entirely capable of excellence and simply were not always given a functional system to operate within. 71. Sputnik 1 launched in 1957 and triggered immediate panic across the United States about Soviet technological superiority. What the official narrative skipped was how most Americans actually confirmed its existence. The satellite broadcast on a frequency so basic that backyard ham radio operators across the country picked it up from their own antennas before any government announcement was made. Regular American hobbyists sitting in their garages with homemade equipment were tracking the Soviet satellite in real time while official Washington was still drafting its public response to the situation. 72. Soviet children's toys were manufactured from a plastic compound so structurally brittle that the average lifespan of a new toy was measured in minutes rather than years. The first contact with a hard floor was typically sufficient to shatter them completely. This created an entire informal economy of toy repairmen who set up operations in apartment courtyards across the USSR, fixing broken toys for small fees. Soviet children received new toys, dropped them once, and their parents carried the pieces downstairs to the courtyard repairman who had been waiting there because he already knew exactly what was coming. 73. Moscow experienced a bread shortage, and Soviet officials solved it without producing any additional bread. Planners simply convened, reviewed the legal definition of a minimum acceptable bread loaf weight, and officially reduced the required size. The shortage was then declared resolved because the new smaller loaves now met the updated minimum standard. No additional flour was milled, no additional loaves were baked, and no additional food entered the supply chain. The Soviet government fixed a food shortage by changing the paperwork, defining what counted as enough food, and then announced the crisis was over. 74. Dzerzhinsk was a Soviet chemical manufacturing city where industrial regulations were apparently treated as optional suggestions rather than enforceable requirements. Factories discharged unregulated toxins into the groundwater and surrounding environment for decades with no meaningful oversight. By 1990, the average life expectancy in Dzerzhinsk had fallen to 42 years, lower than many developing nations at the time. The groundwater reportedly changed color depending on the season based on whatever was being discharged upstream. Soviet environmental reports for the region consistently described conditions as within acceptable parameters throughout the entire period. 75. The Mil V-12 helicopter could lift 40 tons into the air, a world record that still stands, and test pilots who flew it described the experience as balancing a building in a windstorm. The aircraft was aerodynamically unstable in ways that made every flight a negotiation between the pilot and the machine about whether today was the day it decided to stop cooperating. It worked. It lifted things no helicopter had ever lifted. It then never entered production because the Soviet military looked at the test pilot reports describing the experience and decided not to order more of them. 76. Soviet factories produced more tractors in certain years than any nation had ever manufactured in recorded history. The production numbers were extraordinary and celebrated in official reports as evidence of Soviet industrial supremacy. Simultaneously, a tractor parts shortage so severe had developed across the USSR that approximately one-third of the entire national tractor fleet sat unused in open fields rusting because nobody could obtain the components needed to keep them running. The Soviets had built enough tractors to farm the entire planet and lacked the spare parts to operate a third of their own. 77. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg passed American nuclear secrets to Soviet intelligence at enormous personal risk and were ultimately arrested, tried, and executed for espionage. The specific intelligence they delivered had already been obtained by a completely separate Soviet spy network operating independently. Moscow had the information before the Rosenbergs provided it. The Rosenbergs were arrested for handing over secrets the KGB already possessed, tried for delivering intelligence that was already filed in Soviet archives, and executed for a theft that had already been successfully completed by someone else entirely before they ever got involved. 78. Soviet soldiers were issued chemical protection suits designed and tested to survive exactly one nerve agent exposure. A single contamination event would use up the suit's entire protective capability. The next exposure, occurring in the same battle where protection would be most urgently needed, would find the soldier wearing a suit that had already been fully expended. Soviet military procurement examined this design specification, confirmed the suits provided complete protection for one incident, and issued them to soldiers who would be operating in environments where multiple exposures during a single engagement was a realistic and documented possibility. 79. Phobos 1 was a Soviet probe heading toward Mars when a ground controller sat down for a routine maintenance session and transmitted a command that disabled the spacecraft's attitude thrusters. The command should have required two operators to authorize simultaneously. It did not require two operators that day. The single controller sent the command, the probe received it, the thrusters shut down, and Phobos 1 slowly drifted off course and was never heard from again. The entire mission was lost, not to a technical failure or a cosmic accident, but to a typing error sent by one unsupervised person. 80. Soviet kitchen appliances arrived from state stores with electrical plugs that fit no standard Soviet wall outlet. This was not a regional variation or a minor compatibility issue. The plugs were universally incompatible with universally installed outlets across the entire country. The adapter required to make the appliance functional was sold separately at a different state store from the one that sold the appliance. That separate store had its own waiting list for the adapter. Soviet citizens bought an appliance, discovered it could not be plugged in, and then joined a second queue to purchase the part that made the first purchase usable. 81. Watering down milk before sending it to stores was not an occasional scandal in the Soviet Union. It was standard operating procedure at dairy collection points nationwide. Workers added water to raw milk consistently enough that the average fat content of packaged Soviet milk fell measurably below what every label claimed. Citizens buying milk across the entire USSR were purchasing a product that contained less of what milk is supposed to contain, and this was simultaneously true everywhere. Soviet dairy labels were technically fiction printed on bottles of expensive water with ambitions. 82. Driving a tank fully underwater sounds like an impressive military capability until you examine the fine print. The Sprut amphibious tank destroyer gave its crew exactly 6 minutes of onboard air during underwater operation. The emergency exit hatch required a specific unlocking tool to open from inside. That tool was stored in a compartment on the exterior of the hull. Outside the vehicle, underwater, any crew needing emergency escape required a tool that was only accessible after they had already successfully escaped, which rather defeated the purpose of having an emergency tool. 83. Reusing a one-time encryption pad is the single worst mistake possible in military cryptography, and Soviet code operators did it constantly during World War II because pad production could not match message volume. American code breakers running a classified program called Venona spotted the reuse patterns and quietly exploited them for years, decoding thousands of Soviet intelligence messages in the process. Those messages identified over 300 Soviet agents operating inside the United States. The most catastrophic cryptographic error imaginable was committed repeatedly by the people professionally responsible for preventing exactly that error. 84. Grad rocket launchers were loud enough to cause permanent hearing loss in crews within 3 combat deployments, which seems like the kind of information that would prompt someone to issue earplugs. Soviet military supply doctrine disagreed. Grad crews were classified administratively as support personnel rather than combat personnel, and support personnel did not qualify for ear protection under existing regulations. The classification was a paperwork category. The hearing loss was a permanent medical condition. Soldiers fired one of the noisiest weapons in the entire Soviet arsenal without protection because a bureaucratic label said they were not the right kind of soldier. 85. Fake American documentary films produced by Soviet cinema studios used Soviet actors on Soviet streets with hand-painted American signs containing spelling errors visible to any actual American watching. These films were distributed as genuine footage showing the brutal reality of capitalist inner-city life. Moscow audiences recognized their own streets, their own neighbors performing American accents, and incorrectly spelled English words on familiar buildings. The films intended as sobering propaganda became beloved underground comedies. Soviet citizens copied and shared them enthusiastically, not because they believed them, but because they found them genuinely hilarious. 86. KGB listening devices installed in Moscow Olympic athlete hotels in 1980 were placed with such minimal effort at concealment that microphones were plainly visible inside lamp bases and telephone handsets. Western intelligence knew before the games started. The CIA sent American athletes a formal memo with straightforward instructions to wave at the microphones when entering their rooms. United States Olympians therefore arrived at their Moscow hotel rooms, looked around, located the visible Soviet surveillance equipment, waved at it, and then unpacked their bags. This is a thing that actually happened at the Olympics and almost nobody talks about it. 87. Operation Ryan tasked KGB analysts with detecting an American nuclear first strike and ran so intensely that analysts began finding evidence of attack preparations in things that were not attack preparations. Routine NATO military exercises were interpreted as genuine pre-launch activity. In November 1983, a NATO exercise called Able Archer was misread so seriously that Soviet forces moved to actual alert status. The program specifically designed to prevent an accidental nuclear war came close to starting one because analysts trained to find something threatening found it everywhere they looked, including places where it absolutely did not exist. 88. In-tourist guides assigned to Western visitors in the Soviet Union filed written intelligence reports after every tour covering questions asked, interest shown, and political opinions expressed. Western travelers figured this out quickly, and by the 1970s the arrangement was common knowledge among anyone visiting the USSR. Americans on Soviet tours began dictating their preferred report content directly to their guides out loud. They would tell the escort exactly what description they wanted filed, and the escort would write it down because the report still needed to be submitted regardless of how it was produced. 89. Soviet cassette tape shredded itself inside playback machines during normal operation, at a rate consistent enough that electronics repair shops created a dedicated service category for it. The category was labeled specifically for tape-eaten devices and represented roughly 30% of total repair volume across Soviet electronics shops nationwide. Nearly 1 in 3 items brought in for repair was a machine that had destroyed a tape during routine use. Soviet consumer electronics achieved a remarkable equilibrium where the device and the media it played were quietly destroying each other at a scale that kept repair shops reliably busy. 90. KGB defectors arriving in Western countries during the Cold War kept reporting the same unexpected finding to their debriefers. Internal Soviet intelligence documents about American society were accurate, nuanced, and based on real information gathered by competent analysts. The classified picture of America the KGB maintained internally was largely correct. The public picture of America's Soviet leadership broadcast to its own citizens contradicted everything those same intelligence services had documented. Soviet leaders read accurate reports about America in private and repeated fabricated ones in public, and everybody sitting in those briefing rooms understood perfectly well that both things were simultaneously true. 91. Soviet combat divers were issued the SPP-1 underwater pistol, a weapon that actually functioned as designed and represents one of the genuinely few working Cold War Soviet innovations. It fired effectively underwater, which standard firearms cannot do. The divers carried it on every deployment. The problem was that in the weapon's entire service history, no confirmed underwater engagement against an enemy diver ever occurred. Soviet combat swimmers patrolled with a functional, well-engineered weapon specifically built for a combat scenario that never materialized once across the weapon's complete operational lifetime. 92. Building an artificial human heart in the 1960s was an ambitious enough project on its own. Soviet engineers completed a working mechanical prototype, which was a genuine achievement. Then they tested it. The device functioned mechanically but generated heat inside the chest cavity at a rate that killed every single animal test subject from internal overheating within 4 hours of implantation. Soviet scientists had built a heart that worked perfectly as a pump and simultaneously as a slow cooker. The program was classified for 20 years, which was roughly how long it took to stop being embarrassing. 93. Soviet paratroopers in the 1970s were issued personal ejection seats built directly into their aircraft chairs for use if the plane was hit before they could jump manually. The ejection system worked. The force calculation was the problem. Engineers designed the ejection charge based on average male body weight. Anyone under 75 kilograms, which described most of the actual paratrooper corps, experienced an ejection force calibrated for a heavier person hitting a lighter frame. The consistent medical outcome was a broken collarbone on exit. Soviet paratroopers escaped burning aircraft and landed with matching injuries. 94. Sergei Korolev designed Sputnik, engineered the rocket that carried the first human into space, and built the entire foundation of Soviet space capability. In 1938, he was arrested on fabricated treason charges and sent to a Siberian gulag, where he developed scurvy severe enough to cost him most of his teeth. He was released, handed the Soviet space program, and built it into a superpower operation entirely. The USSR never publicly acknowledged his name or existence while he was alive. The man most responsible for Soviet achievements in space was a state secret until after he died in 1966. 95. Soviet military cartographers produced street maps of Western cities so obsessively detailed that they measured individual road widths, recorded bridge load limits, and documented basement depths for buildings across London, Paris, and other major cities. After the Cold War ended, urban planners in several Western cities compared Soviet maps of their own streets against official local government maps and discovered the Soviet versions were more accurate. Cities did not know their own infrastructure as precisely as the military of a foreign government that had been secretly mapping them for decades from the outside. 96. Over 1,000 UR-100 intercontinental ballistic missiles were deployed across Soviet silos during the Cold War, which created a staffing problem that nobody had fully planned for. The USSR ran out of trained crews capable of operating them. Rather than reducing the number of deployed missiles, Soviet military planners assigned some silos to crews who had received fewer than 3 months of technical instruction on the systems they were now responsible for launching. The world's largest nuclear arsenal included an unknown number of missiles operated by people who had learned to operate them over roughly the same time it takes to complete a college semester. 97. Underground survival cities built for Soviet leadership to outlast nuclear war were excavated simultaneously from multiple directions by different ministries that were not communicating with each other. Construction crews dug from both ends of planned tunnel sections and met in the middle, except in several cases they did not meet in the middle. The tunnel systems missed each other underground by dozens of meters, leaving dead-end shafts that connected to nothing on either side. Soviet nuclear survival infrastructure included tunnels that went nowhere, built by separate government departments that were each unaware the other was digging toward them. 98. During the post-Soviet collapse of the early 1990s, a scrap metal dealer purchased what he believed was a conventional decommissioned vessel from the Russian Navy. He began disassembly and discovered somewhere during the process that the vessel contained a nuclear reactor. The dealer had accidentally purchased a nuclear submarine. The Russian government was contacted, assessed the situation, confirmed the error, and quietly reimbursed the dealer for the vessel he had not intended to buy. A private citizen briefly and unknowingly owned a nuclear submarine because the post-Soviet military paperwork situation had become genuinely difficult to track. 99. Pavel Sukhoi built the T-4 supersonic bomber faster than any Western aircraft of its era, and the program was canceled before a single production model was completed. The cancellation had nothing to do with the aircraft's performance. The rival Tupolev Design Bureau, which had been competing for the same contract, lobbied the Politburo directly using political connections accumulated over decades. Tupolev had more friends in the right rooms than Sukhoi did. The fastest Soviet bomber ever designed was eliminated not by engineering failure or budget concerns, but because the competing design bureau knew more powerful people and used that advantage deliberately. 100. Soviet military field rations introduced in the 1940s were never meaningfully updated and remained essentially unchanged through the final days of the USSR in 1991. By the late Soviet period, soldiers received canned meat so old that the tins themselves dated to earlier decades. Soldiers nicknamed the rations Second Front, a World War II-era joke about American Lend-Lease food supplies, because the cans were often genuinely that old. Soviet troops eating field rations in the 1980s were sometimes eating food packaged in the 1950s and calling it by a wartime joke that was now technically accurate. 101. Nuclear test site workers at Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan received small cash bonuses added to their paychecks as compensation for radiation exposure. The payments were called radiation safety bonuses. The workers were never told what radiation was. They were never told what it did to the human body over time. They were never informed that receiving a bonus indicated they were in danger. Soviet officials designed a compensation system for a health hazard without telling the people being compensated that the hazard existed, what it was called, or why they were receiving extra money for standing near it. 102. Soviet authorities developed an official KGB classification system, ranking Western music genres by their perceived threat level to communist ideology. Jazz was considered lower risk. Blues ranked above jazz on the danger scale. Rock and roll sat at the top as the most ideologically contaminating form of music a Soviet citizen could encounter. Formal government documents described rock music as causing moral degradation, sexual deviance, and ideological contamination in that specific language. The KGB assigned analysts to monitor music the same way they monitored foreign intelligence services, treating guitar amplifiers as a national security concern requiring professional attention. 103. Soviet economists in the 1960s designed a complete national computer network called OGAS that would have connected every factory and economic database in the USSR in real time, essentially building a functional Soviet internet before the American version existed. The proposal reached Soviet bureaucrats for approval. Mid-level officials reviewed it carefully, understood exactly what it would do, and killed it. A system making all economic data transparent in real time would also make every bureaucrat's corruption, theft, and falsified quota reporting instantly visible to everyone above them. They buried the Soviet internet to protect their own dishonesty. 104. Venera 13 landed on Venus in 1982 and transmitted color photographs of the Venusian surface back to Earth for 127 minutes, nearly 4 times longer than its designed 32-minute survival time in temperatures hot enough to melt lead. It remains the most successful Soviet planetary mission ever conducted. The probe that landed beside it simultaneously failed within the first 60 seconds of touchdown. The greatest Soviet planetary success in history sat next to one of its most immediate failures, both on the surface of Venus at the same time, transmitting completely different outcomes. 105. Soviet MiG pilots flying combat missions during the Korean War were ordered to speak only Korean on radio communications to conceal Soviet involvement in the conflict. None of the pilots spoke Korean. Every single pilot spoke Russian throughout every engagement without exception. American pilots flying against them monitored shared radio frequencies and heard every word of Russian being spoken in real time during active combat. The Soviet government maintained for years that no Soviet pilots were involved in Korea, while American aviators were listening to those pilots speak Russian to each other during dogfights. 106. Sevmorput was a Soviet nuclear-powered cargo ship that worked correctly, moved cargo reliably, and lost money on every single voyage across its entire operational life. The economics never improved. The ship was laid up repeatedly when the losses became difficult to justify, and reactivated repeatedly afterward, because decommissioning a nuclear vessel costs more than operating one at a loss indefinitely. Soviet planners built a ship so expensive to run that mothballing it was unaffordable and operating it was financially ruinous, leaving the only available option as continuing to sail it at a guaranteed loss with no exit available. 107. Shkval was a Soviet torpedo that traveled 200 knots underwater by surrounding itself in a self-generated bubble of gas, making it nearly 4 times faster than any Western torpedo in existence. It worked exactly as designed. The problem that emerged during development was that the torpedo moved faster than its own guidance system could process information. After launch, it could not be steered. It traveled in a straight line at 200 knots and hit whatever was directly ahead of it. The Soviets built the fastest underwater weapon ever created, and in doing so accidentally removed the part where you aim it. 108. Aldrich Ames was a CIA officer who sold the identities of American intelligence sources inside the Soviet Union to the KGB, and he delivered so many genuine names so consistently that the KGB became suspicious the information was a trap. Real intelligence this complete and accurate was unusual enough that Soviet analysts began doubting it. The KGB responded by arresting and executing their own officers on suspicion of being double agents, killing innocent people because the intelligence Ames provided seemed too accurate to trust. A spy betrayed so many real sources that his handlers started murdering their own colleagues rather than believe him. 109. Uzbekistan had a natural gas field fire in 1966 that burned continuously and could not be extinguished by conventional methods. Soviet engineers proposed detonating a nuclear device underground near the fire to collapse the geological formation feeding it. Everyone involved understood this was an unusual suggestion. They did it anyway. The nuclear device detonated, the geological formation collapsed, and the fire went out in 23 seconds. It worked completely and remains the only confirmed instance in human history where a nuclear weapon was successfully used to extinguish a fire. The Soviets solved a gas leak with an atom bomb, and it worked. 110. Valery Ryumin spent so much accumulated time aboard Soviet space stations that returning to Earth required him to completely relearn basic physical functions. Walking, gripping objects, and sleeping horizontally had all degraded significantly during extended weightlessness and required deliberate rehabilitation after landing. Before that rehabilitation was complete, Soviet mission planners looked at the roster of available cosmonauts, noted that Ryumin had more long-duration spaceflight experience than anyone else, and assigned him to another extended mission. The most experienced long-duration cosmonaut available was sent back to space before fully recovering from the last time space had finished with him. 111. 4 days before the Soviet Union legally ceased to exist in December 1991, someone in a Soviet government office signed paperwork approving continued funding for a magneto-hydrodynamic propulsion ship. This vessel was designed to move through water using superconducting magnets instead of propellers, eliminating mechanical noise entirely. The approval was signed, the funding was allocated, and the authorization was filed. 4 days later, the USSR dissolved completely, and the document became the last major Soviet industrial decision ever made. The final act of Soviet industrial planning was funding a futuristic silent submarine drive system for a country that had 4 days left to exist. And that is 111 reasons why the Cold War was basically the Soviet Union competing against itself and losing. If you made it this far, you either learned something genuinely useful, or you are now deeply concerned about nuclear submarines being sold to scrap dealers, which is a completely reasonable reaction. Either way, you belong here. Drop a comment below telling us which one broke your brain the most. If this video made you feel smarter than a Soviet planner, which is a very low bar, hit subscribe and join the Dumb History family. We make history this entertaining every single week. Like button is right there. It costs nothing and it keeps the algorithm convinced we are doing something important. See you in the next one.